Well, as it's 7 o'clock, I'd quite like to start. And can I first start by welcoming Jackie to your first meeting? It's very good to see you, so I hope you do feel at home quite quickly. And I wonder if I might just ask everybody, perhaps Caroline, starting with you, just to do a quick introduction so that Jackie knows who we are. And
forget to put my microphone on. I'm also a member at Early Town Council as well. Thank you.
I'm Imogen Shepherd Bay. I'm also a Wokingham Borough Councillor, and I'm also a Wokingham Town Councillor, a Wokingham Town Councillor in my case. But yeah, I shall leave it at that.
I'm Sam Actor. I'm Councillor, Wokingham Borough Council for Charleville.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm Councillor for Norreys.
Hello, I'm Neil Allen. I'm Head of Legal Services at Wokingham.
Hi, Jackie. We've met before, but Andrew Moulton, Assistant Director, Governance and Monitoring Officer.
And I'm Maureen Malvern, Borough Councillor for Embrook, and like Imogen, a Town Councillor as well. Confuse things.
Gil Carr, I'm the Clerk from Democratic Services.
And I'm Liam Oliffe. I'm also in Democratic Services.
Thank you. Well, then, first item then, apologies. Do we have any to receive?
Apologies from Keith Baker, Phil Cunnington and Sheena Matthews, Chair.
That's fine, thank you. And then moving on then to the minutes of the previous meeting. If everybody's had a chance to have a look at these. Andrew, sorry, you wanted to?
Well, just to say on the item that was the update on complaints, we talked about the Constitution review that's underway. And I haven't got a report at this evening's meeting, but I did write to all councillors in August inviting comments, areas of concern that councillors would like to focus on. What I would say, I think, in terms of the Constitution, and specifically what's most relevant to this committee, it's the Member Code of Conduct complaint and it's the process for dealing with complaints. This committee, well, firstly adopted pretty much the LGA Model Code of Conduct in its entirety, and also within the last couple of years looked at the process for dealing with complaints. You had an expert independent person come in from outside to advise the committee at that time on that. So I think Chapter 9, where all of that currently resides, I would say is pretty much up to date, but very keen if there are any other points that members would like to pick out, then I'd take those forward into the review.
Rachel?
Yeah, I think the specific point was around the timescales, wasn't it? Because there was one that we talked about last time where it took a very, very long time for it to be resolved. And we talked about the possibility of perhaps escalation if there were particular delays. So I think that was the kind of particular point that we were focusing on. So because that's fairly niche, if that could be brought up as part of the review, I think that'd be worthwhile. Thanks.
Sorry, I keep forgetting with the microphone. So with the minutes then, is everybody happy that I sign them as a true record? Yes? I think that's everybody. Right, thank you. I'll sign those at the end if you like. Nextly then, declarations of interest. Do I have anybody with a declaration of interest? No, that's very straightforward. Public question time. Can I ask, are there any public questions?
There were no public questions, no member questions and no parish town questions, Chair.
Right, thank you. Well, we're going to have to do something about this, I think. Right, moving on then to agenda item 17, update on complaints. I think, Andrew, this might be over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to introduce this, so this is the standard report that you see on page at each meeting. On page 12 and 13 is the detail of 8 new complaints that have come in since the last meeting of the committee in July. I should say as well, actually, I received a further complaint this morning, so it's actually 9 since you met in July. Just to give you some headlines and sort of possible trends that you might be interested in as a committee. So firstly, the question about timescales. You'll see that we are on track at the moment with the dealing within timescales of the complaints that we've had in most recently. Although you'll see on page 12 that the three most recent complaints are still ongoing. Out of all of those complaints, there was just one finding of a breach of the code, which was reported in the decision notice earlier this month. In terms of trends and patterns, you'll note that 5 of the complainants were fellow councillors, which is something that this committee has looked at previously, and whether or not you wanted to introduce anything in that respect. Certainly at the time that you looked at that a couple of years ago now, you weren't minded to introduce anything, but that might be something that you want to keep under review. 3 of the complaints relate to social media. So again, we've got this ongoing pattern of complaints arising as a consequence of something that somebody's posted on Facebook or Twitter or X or whatever it's called nowadays. 4 complaints you'll see were about 1 meeting of the executive in June. So obviously that increased the numbers in this period. And there's just within that group, there's just 1 complaint relating to a parish councillor. So that was really all I wanted to say by means of sort of introduction, Chair, but happy to take any questions.
Rachel.
Thank you. It was just to note with regards to WBC 6, so it stated there that it was reported to council, obviously because of the timing, and it wasn't actually reported to council in the end. I understand there was a question over whether the matter had actually been resolved in line with the conclusion of the investigation. So just looking for some assurance really that will be resolved, and I guess will be reported to next council. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's the intention, Chair, that that will be reported to the November meeting. As you'll be aware, it was on the agenda, but we didn't get to it because of where it ended up in terms of the position or the order on the agenda.
Are there any further questions? Right, Sally.
So there's a lot of councillor to councillor complaints here, relatively. Can I ask if these are noticeable, if there are noticeable patterns along party lines?
I think it's really difficult for me to say as such, not something I sort of would actively monitor. I don't sort of actually have the statistics, but you might imagine that it's less likely that a member from the same party would make a complaint.
I understand that. I think that's not really the sort of patterns I'm asking about. Obviously, I'm very much on the outside when it comes to borough council, so this is to an extent a resident's view that gets coloured, that from the outside the borough looks very party versus party political sniping quite a lot of the time. So I guess that could be answered as in other, is it within a statistical probability that the similar number of complaints are raised by any given party, or is there a tendency for certain parties to make complaints over other parties? I do think that is something that should be monitored and looked at, because that would be indicative of something problematic were it to be politically skewed.
I'm happy to take that away and come back with some more information on that point. What I would say, just elaborating on that a little bit further, is in the criteria for the monitoring officer considering the complaint when it first comes in, I think it actually is worded political tit for tat in the guidance. So that is taken into account. So there's a threshold to cross that something can't just be very overtly political. There needs to be some legitimacy to the complaint.
I've got Imogen and then Sam. So Imogen,
I just kind of wanted to say something on this point, that when there is a complaint against a councillor who is in the same party as you, we have our own internal disciplinary processes. So it's unlikely to hit Andrew's unlikely to see it. So, you know, if I'm a Liberal Democrat, if one of the other Liberal Democrats was a problem, we deal with it internally. So what you're asking, his view is going to be skewed because we won't.
What I'm asking is if the Polka Dot Party raises more complaints than the
That
than the
is
Black
a
and White
question.
Stripes Party.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying
Is there a problem that the Polka Dot Party will have a tendency to raise complaints and use it as a political tool to bash people with,
Yes.
not necessarily as a tit for tat? So I understand that within a party,
within our own
it
party?
is very unlikely to get to this stage, and it's
Yes.
even more problematic if it does.
I wonder if that's something that we might touch on in a later agenda item. Might have relevance there. No, Sam, you want to?
Thank you, Chair. No, just looking at these, but it'd just be useful. I don't know whether this even be possible or not, but when you look at this initially, you think, you know, if there was a way where you could display whether it was, you know, it's the same, like councillor for 4 of these or all of these, because looking at these objectively, you wouldn't know whether this is 8 different or 9 different people, or is this one person but 9 different people complaining against. So if there's a way to display that, yeah, that'd be useful.
Is that something we could look at?
Yeah, I'll certainly take that away. Obviously, with a I can't say that word. You know what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so it would be, say, Councillor A, and you could see that Councillor A had made more than one complaint.
And Sally?
Could we maybe use the similar method you've used for reference, so that it is completely anonymised based on the order that somebody complains or is complained about in any given year? Because I think, again, abstracting it from the personal and political, but into the pattern looking for, that's becomes interesting and relevant and potentially pertinent to their group leaders.
And Caroline?
Right at the beginning, you said you review, and we decided not to review. Is there a trigger point where you think that this committee should look at the level of complaints and review what's happening? Or do we decide?
Well, I think it is for the Standards Committee to decide whether or not you want to change the criteria. As I say, it was looked at a couple of years or so ago, and you decided not to at that time. But at any point in time, you could look at that, and perhaps the next step is to get some statistics and some evidence that will help you form a view as to whether you want to change that or not.
Would it be helpful to ask for those statistics for a future meeting? Is November too early, or?
I think your next meeting is February.
Sorry, yeah, I was getting confused with full
It's a little
council.
while
That will
away.
never do.
But certainly for the next meeting, yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Would that be including the ones that, or specifically for the ones that don't meet the threshold? Because actually, if we're looking at patterns in the round, things that are considered to be not worth investigation are probably the ones that in particular we would want to know about. Are there patterns of complaints as a political tool or something similar?
Yeah, I'll pick that up as part of the statistics.
Yeah, so that sounds fine. I was going to say something there, but I won't. I'll go off and have a think about it. Does anyone else have anything else they want to raise? No, we don't need to vote on this. We just know, don't we? I believe.
Well, just a quick show of hands.
Could I have a quick show of hands to show that we've noted and taken on board everything in the report? Yes, I think that's everybody. Thank you. In favour. So moving on then, I think, Andrew, it's back to you, I feel.
Okay, so this is agenda item 18, and this is the Local Government Association's campaign that they've called Debate Not Hate. I thought it was important to bring this report to Standards Committee tonight. Yeah, this is a national campaign. I think it's relevant to all councils. It's focusing not just on existing councillors, but also focusing on people who may be considering putting themselves forward for election in the future. And you're asked, you've got 2 recommendations to consider. Firstly is to note the report of the LGA, which is in Appendix A. And then secondly, to advise on the specific priorities that you may wish council officers to consider in response to the campaign itself. The Chief Executive, Deputy Chief Executive and myself have had a look at this. We think it's important. We think the Standards Committee needs to lead on this. and shape the approach that the council is going to take. I just by means of sort of headlines, I just point you to page 25 onwards in the LGA's report, and just the sort of types of headings and themes that they're suggesting that you should consider. So firstly, it's about prevention and support. So they talk there about sort of maybe having a small working group to look at this in some more depth. Policies and guidance. So they give an example from Blaby District Council, which I had a look at, which was their personal safety guidance for councillors, which I thought was quite good. And that might be something that quite quickly as a committee, you could ask officers to produce the Wokingham version of that, which may be helpful for all members in terms of some general guidance. Training obviously is an area, and I think it's an area that we can always do more of in this space. Technology, there's some examples there about the sorts of technologies that councils have provided their councillors to keep them safe. Risk assessment, mitigation, engaging with the police. Obviously the police for any serious incidents are going to be the first port of call, but making sure that that relationship and the clarity of where to go to is an important aspect of that. Managing councillor information. So there is provision, as you'll know, for councillors not to have their home addresses published on ballot papers, for example, but there's some other examples that the LGA give there. Setting expectations, which I think a lot of the stage we're at the moment is about sort of promotion and raising awareness, managing public narratives, behaviour and conduct, and I won't read every heading out there, but I think there's some pointers in terms of the things that this committee might wish to start with, and to develop a programme of work in response to the campaign. Thank you, Chair.
Well, can I take comments from anybody who wants to say? So I have Rachel. Anybody else who's likely to? Or we can just go one by one if you like. So Rachel, then, can I start with you?
Thank you. I thought this was an interesting report to read, so thank you for sharing it. And I guess it's not strictly within the remit of the committee, is it? Because the remit of the committee is to do with councillors, conduct rather than sort of members of the public. But I guess it's as good a place as any, isn't it, to look at it? So, I mean, I think we should look at whether we need to put more things in place, because I think it can be difficult to identify. And obviously, as councillors, it's par for the course to have disagreements and to have some criticism, levelled against you. But it's quite hard to identify when that tips into abuse. And I think it says somewhere in the document, it's not against the law to be unpleasant, but even if there's abuse that is not meeting thresholds for police action, it can obviously still be quite damaging for someone if they're on the other end of it. So I think we should consider this quite seriously, and whether we have enough support. I think one good idea would be to do a short survey of councillors, because that might highlight that actually there isn't really that much of a problem, and that perhaps we don't need to do that much more, or it might actually be more of a problem than some of us realise. And it might also highlight if there's a particular problem, for example, with councillors who have a protected characteristic. So that's sort of something we should perhaps know about. So personally, I think it would be good to have a short survey of councillors just to see whether how widespread this problem is, whether people feel supported, or whether they feel it would be useful to get more support. And once we would get that back, we can then look at some of these ideas in there, such as more training, or whether we have a kind of named officer, or whether we have a full kind of policy like Andrew was saying. So that would be my sort of suggestion in terms of the way forward on this one.
Any further comments? Well, I'd just like to add that, yes, I do agree with that. And I think that this is the best place in which to start, because standards does lead into behaviour, and you should really have both together, not standing independently. And I think also it's perhaps good practice that councillors understand where the limits are, so that you don't, excuse me, you could be trying your best with what you might think is a slightly difficult resident, and you can become too enmeshed and you don't see where the boundaries are. And I think to know that there's somebody you can go to say, this is where the boundaries are, would be very useful. And I think also with training, in a way, you can't have too much training, and things change also, and levels of dispute or disagreement can take peculiar forms. So yes, I'd agree with that. So yes, Andrew, would like to ask you to look into those if possible.
No, that's fine. I think that, again, not just doing the survey, but it would raise awareness as well, wouldn't it? That all members could see what the LGA have got and respond to it, and we'd have some real evidence as to whether there's a need.
And I think also if we were doing a survey, it might be easier for councillors to use that as a sort of memory jog, because there might be councillors who've in the past had a rather difficult constituent, for example, who keeps coming back, repeatedly, and you think you've dealt with everything as well as you can, and still there's a difficulty. They might not happen very often, but I think it's best to be prepared for what's a reasonable possibility, and then you're not caught out. I don't know what colleagues think.
Can I say that I think that would help in identifying egregious complaints that are occurring, certainly within the parish councils, and to make people aware of how you define what is actually an egregious complaint rather than one that is justified on LGBT grounds.
Yes, that's a good point. And I wonder if also it's a two-way thing. Perhaps the public will gradually come to realise that there are limits in what they can say. Obviously, taking the point, it's not illegal to be nasty, but it's still not very pleasant. And there need to be guidelines and consequences if people overstep what's reasonable. Well, Sally.
Obviously, the talk about survey is primarily intended at borough, but I wonder if there would be value in rolling that out across the town and parish councils as well that are within our remit, not least because the borough acts as our code of conduct monitoring officer and so forth, but also it may well, if we're looking at statistics and all that sort of things, noting areas where, geographical areas where there is a higher incidence of concerns, should we go with, would give you a place to look, particularly within the borough. Obviously, there are fewer borough councillors from those areas, but it may be worth paying them more attention on the well-being and prevention side of things. So I think there could be value in that as well as to potentially parish and town councillors.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll pick that up with the parish clerks. We'll make sure we can get some information on parishes as well.
Anyone else would care to add anything? Yeah, Caroline.
Actually, it's more of a question. Turned it off. There's a list of residents they recommend that are violent or can be violent. We don't have an existing one of anybody that we should avoid, because 20 years ago we were warned of somebody who could be. I presume we don't have one at the moment.
We don't have a list like I think you're referring to historically that we had, but again, that is a point that we need to take away, consider about how that might be dealt with in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously potentially quite a difficult one because everyone, all residents got the same right to access to councillors and council services. So I think we'd have to tread very carefully if we went down that route.
I was going to add, it would be extreme behaviour. It wouldn't be the abusive, I think you stink. It would be proper threats. And I presume we're having to do this because there has been violence against MPs and councillors. So, yes, unfortunately. Thank you.
It was a really difficult one on the privacy concerns up front as well. And I think that's where, you'll be very key in whether or not that's the sort of thing that can be shared as a corporate body, but that doesn't mean that individual councillors can't kind of say, hey, you know, by the way, this person's in your area, just keep an eye out for them because I've had bad experiences, but you have to be really careful.
Sam, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this report. I think, you know, generally I think it's a really important area. And you know, one of the things I think could be quite useful, maybe moving forward to some sort of like training session, refresher for councillors, maybe on just personal safety. I think, you know, often we've all been, I'm sure, in situations where you've knocked on a door, particularly when canvassing during election, but you know, you knock on the wrong door. It could be a violent situation, could be something going on, you know, untoward in the house. You know, there's all sorts of varying issues where sometimes councillors can be put at risk even. So I think something about that could be useful, particularly as you mentioned with the historic recent issues of violence towards MPs, for example. So I think would be useful.
Thank you. Then Caroline, you.
Just going to add on, when I worked in a retail unit, the police would give us pictures of people to look out for, but we signed a data protection that we would hide it in a lock-up shelf, so in a lock-up cupboard. So there are ways around managing it. There's never any names, we just photographs. Thank you.
So, and I did notice actually there's a suggestion that we might do lone worker or personal safety work, which I think might cover quite a lot of the points raised. Is that something we can progress to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the training is sort of an obvious area. Again, I think Rachel's point is good though, in terms of let's start with a survey, find out what the need is. What crossed my mind on training though is I think you'll have some techniques and skills and experiences to share with your fellow councillors that may be really powerful as well. So it's perhaps not your typical council training where an officer or an outsider provides it, but it's more a sort of workshop of members to share their experiences in terms of what works best in those sort of tricky situations.
Well, I think that's been a very useful report. Yeah, thank you. Has everybody said everything they want to? Yeah, I'll take that as a yes. So coming back to the recommendations then, we're asked to note that the report and the LGA's campaign materials, Appendix A, and also the second item, to advise on the specific priorities for the council to consider in response to the LGA's campaign. Andrew, I might need a bit of advice on this. That's something that we can ask you to look at.
Well, I think probably the first priority that you've identified as a committee is to undertake a survey, and that will then inform what you want to do next.
That sounds fine, thank you. So just to be clear then, item 2, the second recommendation to advise on the specific priorities. At this stage, we're going to ask you to look into a member survey of the Borough Council and the towns and parishes. Sally.
Does the council have anything like it's mentioned here under policies and guidance? Blaby District Council and Bradford Metropolitan District Council both have guides to personal safety for councillors. Does this council have anything along those lines?
It doesn't, and I mean, I could suggest that I could circulate a Wokingham version of that to the committee for you to consider, or I could bring it back to the next meeting. Again, I don't want to preempt what might come out of a survey. It might not be something that members feel the need for.
Do we have a preference as to whether Andrew circulates that or whether it comes back to the next committee? Sorry, Rachel, I didn't say.
Yes, I mean, my personal preference would be to wait for the survey and then decide, because those are good policies, but they struck me as quite full on. So it might be we you know, depending on what the survey results are, we might decide actually we don't need that level. So personally, I prefer to wait for the survey and then decide whether we want to do that. Otherwise, you know, you might be potentially wasting time mocking something up which we don't then adopt.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. And Sally, did you want to come back on that? All right. So should we ask for support for the survey then, or do we need to take a vote on that? Is that sensible?
Quick show of hands.
Yeah, so a quick show of hands for doing the survey, please. Any against? Any abstentions? No, that's fine, thank you. So we turned it off. So could we ask you to look into doing a survey? And then following on from the results of the survey, that should give us a better direction to know where to explore further. Is everybody happy with that?
I'll come back to the next meeting in February.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes,
I'm assuming we're making sure that the survey is anonymous and all that kind of stuff.
I'm sure we can leave it in very capable hands.
Yes.
That's fine, thank you. Should I say here, if anybody has any queries, would you be able to field them? So if anybody does have anything they want to raise after tonight about the survey, then please contact Andrew. So coming back to the recommendations then, have we done what we need to?
Yes.
We've accepted it, we've noted the report and we've said we want to go for the survey. Have I missed anything out? Excellent. So I think, does that conclude the meeting?
It does.
Oh, well, I could thank everybody for coming, and especially Jackie for being your first meeting. It's lovely to see you, and thank you very much for attending, and see you next time. Thank you.